hit the subscribe button.
Welcome back to the channel. Today we'll talk about how to close the racial wealth gap. We will not talk about the causes of the current wealth gap. I highly recommend that you take a look at the history books, and that will tell you a number of different ways where policies in the United States have led to the current wealth gap that we see. But what we'll talk about is a number of different wealth generating areas where we push to basically reduce the wealth gap or close that wealth gap. As it currently stands, the wealth gap is estimated to continue to grow. According to the Federal Reserve, they had a report where it showed that the average Black and Hispanic or Latino household earns about half as much as the average white household does. And on average owns only 15 to 20% as much net wealth as the white household. What this translates to essentially is that Blacks, which occupies about 16% of the population, only owns about 2.9% of wealth in the United States. Hispanics only about 2.8% of wealth in the United States and account for about 11% of the population. Generally speaking, whites make up about 68% of the population, but owns about 87% of the wealth in this country. One of the striking statistics here in the United States is the fact that the 400 richest American billionaires have more total wealth than all Black American households combined. Now, that is an interesting stat, that 400 individuals have more wealth than an entire population or group of people. That is ridiculous in some ways. And the other stat here is that on average, the net wealth of a typical white family is about 10 times greater than that of a typical Black family. Over the projected years, what this goes to is the fact that by 2053, the net worth of the average Black family will be about zero, right? And for Hispanic families, 20 years later, their net worth will also hit zero. That is the wealth gap that we'll talk about and discuss today. All things being equal, if you're looking at where things are a bit more equal, you'd expect the proportion of the population to equal the proportion of wealth, right? So if you have a population or a group of people who make up 30% of the population, you would expect that they may own, about 30% of the wealth. As you could see with regard to whites, Hispanics, and Blacks, that is not the case in the United States of America. So with regard to the wealth gap and how you could address it today, let's take a look at some of the wealth drivers in the United States. And when you take a look at that, what comes out is really entrepreneurship, ownership of real estate, and stock market returns. Right? When you look at where wealth is being created, those are the main areas. So these are prime targets for closing that wealth gap. But when you look at the numbers within each of these different disciplines, you begin to see why the wealth gap is the way it is. When you look at entrepreneurship, in the United States, about 70% of businesses are owned by whites, 14% by Hispanics, 6% by Blacks. And when you look at all the work that's being done in Silicon Valley or in Boston in the startup area where you have these massive valuations or these new and exciting companies coming out, and that in itself generate a lot of wealth, you see that only 3% of total venture capital funding actually goes to Black and Hispanic founders. Furthermore, when you look deeply at the statistics here, you begin to see that industries that minorities tend to be more so associated with, for example, where they start businesses, you can see that those tend to be more of service or retail industry type businesses, which means that they're more frontline workers, which in COVID times is not necessarily a good thing, but also they tend to serve more low-income or minority communities. So what you have then is that a lot of minority business owners, because of their areas of focus or expertise, they've missed out on the boom that's been happening with regard to high-skill sectors in the tech industry, right? So you begin to see now, based on the numbers, that the wealth gap is somewhat the way it is. And let's for the moment, not address some of those historical policies that have been put in place that led to this wealth gap, But let's look at the issues that will now exacerbate the wealth gap going forward, and you begin to see entrepreneurship is one of those areas. So to combat the wealth gap or to close that wealth gap, it's important to increase minority representation in entrepreneurship, specifically high-skilled work or the high-skilled labor force, and more specifically the tech industry. Now that leads to other questions with regard to education and opportunity and access, and we'll not address that here today. The second avenue to look at with regard to wealth generation is the stock market. On average, only about half of Americans actually invest in the stock market. But when you look at those who are highly educated in the upper class, greater than 90% of these individuals invest in the stock market. If you look at top 10% of wealth, you begin to see that over 94% of those individuals own stock, whereas minorities are not well represented in those areas. So when you look at who owns stock in America or who invests in America, very little minorities are actually investing based on the proportion of the population. But when you break it down a little bit further, what you find is that 64% of whites own stocks, only 35% of blacks, and 24% of Hispanics own stocks or participate in the stock market. So what you have here is that all that boom that you had since 2008 in the stock market, a lot of that has gone to those who are very wealthy already and not necessarily minorities, based on the proportion of who is actually investing in the stock market. So to close the wealth gap or to narrow that gap, it's important for minorities to begin to participate in the stock market, not simply throwing your money at it, but to understand the stock market and how to generate wealth, whether that be with an ETF or some other low-cost option for investing. The third big driver of wealth in the United States tends to be real estate. And when you talk about real estate and the wealth gap, it's hard not to discuss the policies of redlining and other governmental policies that have affected the wealth generation of a lot of minorities in this country. But that is not the topic for today. What we're talking about today is to identify a different factor that can be affected to cause the narrowing of the wealth gap. Today, Americans have a home ownership rate of about 65%. About 73% of whites own their home or have a mortgage on their home currently. Only 48% of Hispanics and 42% of blacks own their home. Now, this matters, and it matters not only about the home ownership rate, but also the value of the home that you own. And for minorities, it's a double whammy, right? It's a double whammy because of certain policies and also certain situations, minorities do not own homes to the level that whites do. But also, where minorities own homes, they're valued less than those of whites. It is no secret that home prices have risen dramatically since the last financial crisis. And based on what we just discussed as far as the home ownership rate, also the value of homes owned by minorities as compared to whites, you begin to see that minorities are not reaping the benefits that they could have reaped if they'd owned more in the real estate realm. So to close the wealth gap, increase real estate ownership in minority community. Close the wealth gap, it'll take a multi-pronged approach, and it is more complex than we have discussed today. And we have not addressed the effects of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, or redlining. But what we're looking at here is how do we move forward? And today it's estimated that the wealth gap will continue to grow to the point where minorities' wealth net worth will go to zero in the next 50 years or so. To change that projection, it's important that areas such as entrepreneurship, ownership of real estate, and participation in the stock market be of significance. By increasing minority participation in these areas, again, entrepreneurship, ownership of real estate, and participation in the stock market, we can begin to address the racial wealth gap, or at least close the racial wealth gap, or at least stop the racial wealth gap from growing and begin to reverse this process. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel.